When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, the silence becomes a mirror, not a weapon. That's the shocking part. Most people think no contact is a strategy to make someone miss you. But when both people truly go quiet, the dynamic changes in a way the avoidant can't escape, because the usual story they tell themselves disappears. They can't say, "They're pressuring me." They can't say, "They're chasing me." They can't say, "They're being dramatic." They can't blame your emotions for their shutdown, because your emotions are no longer in front of them. There's just silence. And in that silence, the avoidant finally has to sit with themselves. For an avoidant, distance usually feels like relief. Distance lowers the nervous system alarm. Distance gives them control. Distance lets them breathe. That's why they withdraw when things get intimate or emotionally intense. But the relief they feel depends on one hidden factor: the connection still being alive somewhere. Even if they pull away, they often assume you're still thinking, still hoping, still reachable. Your presence may be quiet, but in their mind it's still there. That invisible thread keeps them comfortable. It lets them take space without fully feeling loss. When you also stop contacting, that thread starts to feel cut. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, unsettling way. And that is when the silence becomes a mirror. A mirror forces self-awareness. It reflects back the parts of them they avoid: guilt, regret, longing, confusion, pride, and the uncomfortable truth that they contributed to the distance. Because with no messages coming in, they don't get to regulate by reacting to you. They can't soothe themselves by thinking, "I'll reply later." They can't keep you on standby by sending a breadcrumb. They don't get the comfort of your availability. They are left with their own mind, and the mind starts replaying what the nervous system couldn't feel while it was busy avoiding. This is why the first phase can look like calm, then suddenly turn into restlessness. At first, they may feel free. They may feel lighter. They may tell themselves, "This is better." But then the mirror starts working. The quiet becomes loud. The moments they dismissed begin resurfacing. The look on your face when you were hurt. The last message you sent. The tone in your voice. The parts they avoided talking about. The ways they knew they were unfair, but didn't want to admit it. The things they told themselves to justify leaving. When no contact is mutual, the avoidant loses their favorite distraction: your reaction. They may have relied on your chasing or your anger to confirm you still cared. Even your pain kept them central. Even conflict kept the bond alive. But now there's no conflict, no chase, no emotional noise. And without emotional noise, they can't pretend the relationship is still alive by default. Silence forces the question, is this over? And that question is terrifying, because it means their actions have consequences they can't control. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where many avoidants begin to feel what they delayed feeling. They grieve differently. You often feel pain immediately, because your system seeks closeness. They often feel numbness first, because their system seeks distance. But numbness doesn't last forever. When both people stop contacting, their numbness has nowhere to go. There's no push-pull to distract them. There's no opportunity to reset the dynamic with a casual check-in. So the nervous system begins to thaw. And as it thaws, feelings they thought were gone start returning. They start wondering what you're doing. They start imagining you moving on. They start rereading old conversations. They start checking your online presence. They start remembering the good moments without the pressure of the bad moments. And the shocking part is this: their feelings can grow in the silence, because the silence removes the pressure that triggered their defenses. Without the demand of closeness, they can finally access the longing. But the mirror also shows them the cost. If they reach out, they may have to repair. If they reach out, they may be rejected. If they reach out, they may have to admit fault. So they sit in the mirror longer. That's why mutual no contact is so powerful. It doesn't chase them into love. It simply removes their escape routes. It forces them to face what they feel without hiding behind your behavior. And whether they come back or not, the mirror changes you too. Because while they're staring at themselves, you're rebuilding your center. You're learning what peace feels like without waiting. You're learning that silence can be self-respect. You're learning that your worth doesn't depend on someone else's readiness. And that's why this silence is shocking. It exposes the truth on both sides. It reveals who can face reality and grow, and who can only tolerate connection when it's on their terms. When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, no contact doesn't just create space, it removes the avoidant's biggest advantage: the idea that distance equals control. In most avoidant dynamics, space is the tool they use to regulate themselves and to steer the relationship. When they feel overwhelmed, they withdraw. When they withdraw, you react. You chase, you explain, you plead, you try to fix. That reaction is what makes their withdrawal powerful, because it proves they can still move you. It proves they still have access. It proves the bond is still alive through your attachment, even if they're emotionally absent. But when you also stop reaching, the math changes. Their distance no longer produces the same result. It no longer creates your pursuit. It no longer creates reassurance. It no longer creates emotional proof that you're still there. Their old tool stops working, and for an avoidant, that can feel like losing the steering wheel. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where uncertainty begins. And uncertainty is the one thing avoidants claim to hate, but secretly depend on. They hate uncertainty when it threatens them, but they often create uncertainty to protect themselves. Because if the relationship stays unclear, they don't have to fully commit, and they don't have to fully detach. They can hover. They can return whenever they want. They can keep you as a backup emotional home base. Uncertainty gives them flexibility. No contact from both sides takes away that flexibility. Because when you don't chase, their distance stops being a negotiation tactic and starts becoming a real risk. Now the silence is not just space. Now the silence could be the end. And that possibility activates their attachment system. Not always in a mature way, but in a real way. The avoidant nervous system is built to deactivate feelings under closeness pressure, but it can reactivate feelings when closeness is threatened by loss. At first, they may feel relief. Relief is normal for an avoidant. Pressure is gone. No one is asking questions. No one is asking for repair. No one is expecting emotional presence right now. They can breathe. But that relief depends on believing the connection still exists in the background. Many avoidants are calm when they think you're still available. The calm is not peace. The calm is control. When you stop contacting too, control disappears. They can't predict you. They can't sense your pull. They can't read your emotional temperature. They can't count on you to keep the thread alive. And the mind starts doing what it always does when it loses certainty. It starts searching. It starts scanning. It starts trying to restore what it lost. That's why avoidants begin checking your socials, asking mutual friends, replaying conversations, remembering old moments, suddenly feeling curious about you again. It's not random. It's the nervous system trying to restore access. This is where many people get shocked. They expect the avoidant to forget them in silence. But mutual no contact often makes the avoidant think more. Because there is no longer a chase to distract them. There is no longer a conversation to control. There is no longer a predictable pattern. They are forced into uncertainty, and uncertainty activates attention. Because what you can't control, you start obsessing about. This is also why avoidants sometimes come back with small tests. Not a full return. A ping, a breadcrumb, a me, a reaction to your story. They're checking if their old control still exists. They're checking if you're still reachable. They're checking if they can reopen the loop without fully stepping into accountability. It's the old distance tool wearing a different outfit. And your response determines whether the dynamic changes or repeats. If you respond like the old pattern, fast, emotional, fully open, the avoidance nervous system relaxes. Control returns. Their urgency fades. They can disappear again. But if you stay steady, if you don't reward crumbs, if you require clarity and repair, they realize something that hits deeply. Distance no longer gives them leverage. That's when they either grow or leave for real. Because now the relationship is not being held together by your pursuit. It's being held together by their willingness to show up. And that is the shock. No contact exposes what was hidden. It reveals whether they were staying connected because of love and maturity, or because your chasing made it easy to keep you without committing. So keynote 2 is this mutual no contact removes the avoidance comfort of controlling the connection through distance. It takes away their ability to regulate themselves while still having guaranteed access to you. It forces uncertainty. It forces reflection. It forces a real choice. And whether they step up or vanish, you finally stop living inside a dynamic where your emotional labor keeps the relationship alive. You stop feeding the tool that kept you stuck. You let silence do what chasing never could. Reveal the truth. When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, their nervous system often confuses peace with loss, and that's where the psychology gets shocking. In the beginning, silence can feel like relief for them. The pressure is gone. No one is asking for reassurance. No one is asking for repair. No one is confronting them with feelings they don't know how to hold. Their body finally unclenches. They may even tell themselves, "See, I'm better without this." But that better is not always true peace. It's the first layer of avoidance, the calm that comes from escaping emotional intensity. Then time passes, and the relief starts turning into something else. Because there's a difference between peace and emptiness, and avoidants often don't notice the difference until it's too late. Peace is calm with connection inside. Emptiness is calm with a void inside. At first, both feel similar. Both are quiet. Both are low intensity. But emptiness begins to itch. It begins to pull at them in the background. They start feeling restless at night. They start getting distracted during the day. They start thinking of you randomly. They start replaying memories without meaning to. They start feeling something like longing, but it scares them, so they label it as boredom, nostalgia, or curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the nervous system waking up. An avoidant system is designed to shut down feelings when closeness feels overwhelming. That's why they can look cold during conflict or when intimacy grows. Their emotions don't disappear. They get pushed underground. And underground emotions don't stay quiet forever. Silence, especially mutual silence, gives those buried emotions space to rise. Not because you're doing a technique, but because there's nothing left to distract them. Now here's where the confusion happens. They interpret the quiet as proof that you're gone. And that triggers alarm. Even avoidants who crave distance still have attachment needs. They still want to matter. They still want to feel chosen. They still want to know there's a safe place to return to. So, when the silence is mutual, the part of them that relied on your emotional availability starts panicking. They may not call it panic. They'll call it missing you. But it's deeper than that. It's the shock of realizing the connection may not be waiting for them anymore. This is why their internal experience often goes relief key emptiness anxiety obsession. The obsession doesn't always look like begging. Avoidants rarely beg directly. Their obsession looks like checking, watching, scanning, looking for signs. They might check your social media. They might read old chats. They might look at your profile picture. They might ask mutual friends how you are. They might suddenly remember tiny details about you. They might feel irrational jealousy at the thought of you moving on. Because their nervous system is trying to answer one question. Did I lose them? And the irony is, the more they try not to care, the more their mind circles you. Because the mind obsesses over what it can't resolve. In the old dynamic, they could regulate by withdrawing while still knowing you were emotionally there. That felt safe. But mutual no contact removes that safety. Now they can't tell where they stand. They can't read your feelings. They can't rely on your chase to confirm attachment. And that uncertainty activates obsessive thinking, not because they're suddenly secure, but because control is gone. This is also why they may start romanticizing the relationship. Their brain replays the good moments more than the painful ones. They forget how trapped they felt. They forget the pressure. They remember your warmth, your loyalty, your softness. Because the pressure that triggered their defenses is absent now. So the feelings they blocked begin showing up clearly, and they confuse that clarity with a sign they should return. But here's the most important part: obsession is not the same as readiness. A nervous system can crave what it can't handle. An avoidant can miss you deeply and still struggle to show up consistently once contact resumes. That's why the next move matters. Many avoidants don't return with a full apology. They return with a test, a breadcrumb, a reaction. Something small to see if you're still there, because they want to relieve the anxiety without stepping into the vulnerability of repair. So keynote 3 is this: when both of you go silent, the avoidant's initial relief can transform into emptiness, and emptiness can transform into obsession, because their nervous system reads mutual peace as potential loss. The silence stops feeling safe and starts feeling final. And that's when they become hyper, aware of your absence, not because they're trying to win you back, but because their body is finally feeling what it avoided, the cost of keeping distance when love was present. When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, they often start grieving in reverse. And that's one of the most shocking parts of no contact. Most people assume grief happens immediately after the breakup. But avoidants frequently don't grieve the way you do. You usually feel the loss right away, because your nervous system reaches for connection. Your body feels the absence like a wound. You cry, you replay, you ache, you question. You miss them in the smallest moments. Your grief is loud early, because your system is trying to restore closeness. Avoidants often do the opposite. Their grief is delayed, because their first response is deactivation. Deactivation is the avoidant nervous system going numb, going logical, going busy, going distracted, going fine. It's their survival strategy. When closeness becomes emotionally intense, they shut down feelings to feel safe. So when the relationship ends or contact stops, their nervous system initially reads it as relief. Not because they didn't care, but because the pressure of intimacy and conflict is gone. Their body finally gets to breathe. They sleep better for a while. They feel lighter. They tell themselves, this was the right decision. They might even look unbothered. But that unbothered phase is not closure, it's anesthesia, and anesthesia wears off. Ladies and gentlemen, grief always collects its debt. If you don't feel it now, you feel it later. If you don't process it consciously, you process it through obsession, nostalgia, jealousy, irritability, depression, or sudden regret. Avoidants often postpone grief by staying busy, staying social, staying distracted, jumping into work, scrolling, or even rebounding. Anything to avoid sitting in silence with their own emotions. That's why mutual no contact is so powerful. It removes the distractions that come from the push-pull dynamic. There's no conversation to manage. There's no conflict to blame on you. There's no breadcrumbing to keep the connection half alive. There is simply absence. And absence forces reality. Here's how the reverse grief often unfolds. First, they feel relief. They tell themselves the distance proves they're better off. They enjoy the control of not being emotionally responsible. They interpret the quiet as freedom. Then, the relief starts to crack. The nervous system begins scanning for the familiar. They reach for their phone, and there's no message. They go through their day, and a moment happens that used to be shared. A song. A memory. They see something you'd love. And for the first time, they feel the hollow space where you used to be. But instead of calling it grief, they call it random thoughts. They call it just nostalgia. They call it curiosity. Because grief feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability is what they avoid. Then, the emotions they numbed begin surfacing in waves. It might show up as irritability, restlessness, or sudden anxiety. It might show up as checking your social media. It might show up as jealousy at the idea of you moving on. It might show up as regret that hits them at night when distraction is gone. Their grief arrives late, but when it arrives, it can hit hard, because it's been waiting. This is why avoidants often come back after time has passed, not immediately. Their delayed grief takes time to wake up. Their system needed distance to feel safe enough to feel anything at all. While you were grieving and processing, they were often dissociating and avoiding. But when both of you go silent, their mind starts replaying the relationship from a safer distance, and they can finally access emotions they couldn't tolerate in real time. That's reverse grief, numb first, pain later. You experienced pain first, then you slowly move toward acceptance. They experienced numbness first, then they get hit with pain when the numbness fades. And the pain often feels confusing to them, because it arrives after they thought they were fine. That's why they can suddenly message you months later with, "I've been thinking about you a lot," or "I didn't realize what I had," or "I miss you." They're not necessarily lying. They're catching up emotionally to what you felt earlier. But here's the key. Delayed grief is not the same as emotional maturity. An avoidant can miss you deeply and still not have the skills to sustain closeness. They can feel regret without knowing how to repair. They can feel pain without knowing how to communicate. So when they return, you don't measure their growth by their sadness. You measure it by their accountability and consistency. Keynote 4 is the truth about silence. When both stop contacting, the avoidance defenses can't stay high forever. The numbness eventually cracks and grief arrives late. And in that late grief, they finally feel the weight of your absence. Not because you chased them into missing you, but because time and silence removed the distractions and forced the emotional debt to be paid. When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, the fantasy breaks and reality hits. And this is where no contact becomes truly shocking. Because in many avoidant dynamics, the relationship survives inside a fog of ambiguity, mixed signals, half conversations, and emotional loopholes. They can tell themselves stories that protect them from the full truth. They're fine. They're too needy. I needed space. We're just on a break. I can come back whenever. That's the fantasy. The belief that they can keep you in their life without fully choosing you, and without fully losing you. No contact from both sides destroys that fantasy, because the fantasy only survives when there's still evidence of your availability. When you're still checking in, when you still react, when you still respond, when you still ask for closure, when you still carry emotional labor. Even if they're distant, your effort keeps the bond warm in the background. It lets them live with the comfort of access, without having to pay the price of commitment. But when you disappear too, the evidence disappears, and the avoidance mind is forced to confront a reality it was able to avoid. You were not a guaranteed resource. You were a person who can leave, a person who can stop caring, a person who can close the door. And that realization is what makes their emotions spike, because now the relationship is not living in potential, it's living in consequence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is when the avoidant starts remembering your value in a different way. Not as an abstract idea, not as a safe backup, not as someone who will always be there, but as a real presence that is now absent. They begin to notice the things your love used to do for them. The calming, the reassurance, the stability, the emotional softness you brought, the way you held space even when they were inconsistent, the way you kept trying, the way you made them feel wanted without demanding too much. And when that's gone, they feel the impact of the loss. This is why no contact often makes avoidance wake up later. Because the wake up isn't created by your words. It's created by the absence of your energy. It's created by the sudden silence where there used to be emotional labor. Your presence used to cushion them from consequences. Your absence removes the cushion, and the fantasy breaks in 3 places. First, it breaks in control. They can't control the timeline anymore. They can't assume you'll be waiting. They can't rely on their old move, withdraw and return, because they don't know if return will still be welcomed. The uncertainty stings. Second, it breaks in identity. Many avoidants secretly rely on being the one who is hard to keep. It becomes part of their emotional identity. If you leave, it forces a painful question. What if I'm not the prize anymore? What if I'm the problem? That's why they may feel shame, defensiveness, or sudden regret. Third, it breaks in comfort. They may have been using your connection as emotional regulation, even from a distance. Knowing you were there reduced their anxiety. Knowing they could reach you reduced loneliness. Knowing you cared reduced guilt. Now that comfort is gone, and they feel a new emptiness they can't blame on you. So reality hits, they lost something real. But here's the important twist. When reality hits, 2 very different avoidant reactions can appear. One is genuine reflection. They start owning their role. They start admitting what they avoided. They stop blaming you. They become clearer. They take steps toward repair. They approach you with humility, not entitlement. That's growth. The other reaction is emotional scrambling. They come back with intensity but not maturity. They send breadcrumbs, nostalgic messages, sudden, miss you, texts, jealousy. Late night pings. They're trying to restore access so the discomfort goes away. That's not growth. That's withdrawal symptoms. Because the fantasy broke, and they want the fantasy back. This is why your response matters. Because your response determines whether the fantasy rebuilds, or whether reality stays. If you reward breadcrumbs with full access, the fantasy returns. They feel safe again and the urgency disappears. But if you require clarity, repair, and consistent effort, you keep reality in place. You teach the nervous system a new rule. Access to you is not guaranteed. It's earned through responsibility. Keynote 5 is the truth about mutual no contact. It breaks the avoidance protective stories and forces them to feel what they were able to avoid while you were present. It turns potential into consequence. It turns into, I might have actually lost them. And that moment can create real change, but only if reality is allowed to remain real. And you stop offering your love as a cushion for someone who hasn't learned how to hold it properly.